My marriage to John was like stepping into a fairy tale, one of those stories you hear about but never quite believe could happen to you. We met in college where we were both studying business administration, and from the very first moment, I felt this extraordinary connection with him. His warm smile and the way he looked at me, as if I was the only person in the world, made me believe he was my destiny. After graduation, we started working at the same company, spending every moment together from dawn till dusk. Our colleagues would tease us, saying we were inseparable, and they were absolutely right. John was everything to me. My best friend, my confidant, my lover. I remember the day he proposed as if it were yesterday, one of those perfect moments frozen in time. We were in the park, and the setting sun had painted the sky in the most beautiful shades of orange I'd ever seen. He got down on one knee, pulled out a velvet box from his pocket, and looked at me with such love in his eyes that my heart nearly stopped. With trembling voice, he told me I was the light of his life and his reason for being, asking me to be his wife. Through tears of joy, I nodded and threw myself into his arms, crying out, "Yes, of course." Our wedding was like a dream come true, held in a small suburban church surrounded by our closest friends and family. I remember thinking that I couldn't possibly be any happier than I was at that moment. The first few months of our marriage were absolutely magical. We lived in a cozy little apartment in the heart of the city, and every morning I would wake up to the smell of John's coffee. We'd sit together on our tiny balcony, eating breakfast and talking about our future, building castles in the air. But everything changed when John found that job opening in the neighboring town. It was an incredible opportunity for him, a promotion he couldn't refuse. Though my heart ached at the thought of leaving our beloved city, I knew we had to seize this opportunity. The night he made the decision, he tried to get me excited about it, telling me it would be a new adventure, a fresh start in a new town. I nodded, trying to match his enthusiasm, reminding myself it wasn't that far and we could always come back on weekends. A month later, we moved to the neighboring town. We rented a larger house, thinking about our future and the possibility of starting a family. Everything seemed to be going smoothly until a week after the move, when John dropped the news that would change our lives forever. One evening during dinner, he asked me how I would feel about his mother, Beth, moving in with us since she was living alone. I felt my entire body freeze. Beth and I had never been close, and I'd always felt like an outsider in her son's life, but I knew how important she was to John. Trying to keep my voice steady, I asked him if he was sure about this, reminding him it would be a big change. He nodded eagerly, explaining that he was worried about his mother being alone as she got older, and insisted we had plenty of space. I took a deep breath and forced a smile, telling him if he thought it was for the best, I would agree. Beth moved in with us a week later. At first, everything seemed fine, with her showing gratitude and trying not to interfere with our daily lives. But gradually, her true nature began to emerge. It all started with something small. One day, while I was cooking, Beth came into the kitchen and started criticizing the way I was cutting vegetables. With a condescending tone that made my skin crawl, she told me I was doing it all wrong and that she would show me the proper way to cut tomatoes. I tried to brush off these comments, but they became more and more frequent with each passing day. She started criticizing everything, my cooking, my cleaning, even my choice of clothes, until I felt like a stranger in my own home. But the worst was yet to come. One day, Beth approached me with a worried look on her face, using that sugary sweet voice that made my stomach turn. She asked if I could lend her some money for medication, claiming her pension wasn't enough this month. Without hesitation, I pulled out my wallet and gave her the amount she requested, telling her it wasn't a problem. But this was just the beginning of a nightmare I couldn't have imagined. The requests for money became more frequent, and the amounts grew larger. There was always some excuse. Medication, new clothes, gifts for friends, and though she promised to pay me back each time, that day never came. When I tried to discuss this situation with John, he always defended his mother. He insisted we couldn't refuse her anything because she was his mother, claiming she wasn't asking for much. But I knew better, watching our savings dwindle rapidly while the tension in our marriage grew day by day. One night, after Beth asked for a large sum for medical tests, I finally confronted John. I told him this couldn't continue, that his mother was depleting our savings and we needed to set boundaries. John looked at me as if I'd lost my mind, calling me selfish and insisting we should give his mother money whenever she needed it. I tried to make him understand, pleading with him to see how his mother was manipulating us, how she always had an excuse to ask for money, how unhealthy this was for everyone. He stood up in anger, telling me he wouldn't listen to me insulting his mother and that if I couldn't accept the situation, maybe I needed to rethink things. That night, I slept on the couch, my heart shattered and my mind full of questions. I couldn't help wondering how we'd ended up here, and where the man I'd fallen in love with had gone. The days that followed were pure hell. Beth, sensing my vulnerability, increased her demands. John became increasingly distant, spending more time at work and less time at home. I felt trapped, like a bird in a gilded cage, living in a place that no longer felt like my home. Every morning, I would wake up with a knot in my stomach, dreading what new demands the day might bring. One day, I made a decision. I couldn't continue living like this. I needed to take back control of my life and my marriage. I decided to have one final, serious conversation with John, one last chance to save what remained of our love. But fate had other plans. The final straw came one afternoon when Beth walked into the living room with a broad smile on her face. She announced excitedly that she'd decided to get cosmetic surgery, claiming the doctor said it would make her look years younger. My heart sank as I knew what was coming next. She continued, saying the surgery was quite expensive and asking if we could help with the payment. I looked at John, hoping he would finally set a boundary, but to my horror, I watched as he nodded with a smile. Without missing a beat, John told her of course he would do anything necessary for her. In that moment, something inside me shattered beyond repair. I couldn't take it anymore, and the words burst from my mouth before I could stop them. No, I said firmly, enough. This ends now. I want a divorce. The silence that followed was deafening. Beth stared at me in shock, while John seemed unable to process what he'd just heard. Just like that, I watched my perfect marriage crumble before my eyes. All that remained was the painful reality that the fairy tale I thought I was living in was nothing but an illusion. The tension in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. My declaration of divorce had fallen like a bomb, leaving both John and Beth momentarily speechless. Beth was the first to break the silence, waving her hand dismissively as if shooing away an annoying fly. With a forced laugh and nervous tone, she told me not to say such foolish things, insisting it was just a small surgery. I felt my blood boiling. A small surgery? The amount she was asking for could buy a new car. Taking a deep breath and fighting to maintain my composure, I looked her straight in the eye. I told her this wasn't just about the surgery. It was about everything, the constant demands for money, the criticism, the way she had invaded our lives. John, who had been in a state of shock until then, suddenly seemed to come back to life. He jumped up from his chair, blushing with anger, and shouted at me. He called me selfish, demanding to know how I could abandon his mother when she just needed a little help. His words cut deep into my heart. Selfish? Me? After everything I had endured. I felt tears welling up but refused to show weakness. A little help? I repeated in disbelief, reminding him that his mother had been manipulating us for months, asking if he hadn't noticed our savings disappearing. But John wouldn't listen. He moved closer until his face was just inches from mine, and I could feel his warm breath as he spoke. He called me ungrateful, saying after everything they had done for me, this was how I repaid them. Then he delivered the final blow. If I wanted a divorce, fine, he could easily find someone better. His words hit me like a physical slap across the face. Someone better? After all the years we'd spent together, after all the sacrifices I'd made for him, I felt something break inside me permanently this time. With my voice shaking from controlled anger, I told him to go ahead and find someone who could tolerate his lies and his mother's manipulation, because I was done. I turned to leave the room, but Beth's voice stopped me. She spat out that I was an ungrateful child, asking how I could do this after they had welcomed me into their family and given me a home. I turned back slowly to face her. A home? I asked, you call this a home? I've been living in hell. Every day has been a battle since you moved in, every conversation a war zone. This isn't a home, it's a prison. John stepped between his mother and me, his face a mask of fury. He told me not to speak to his mother that way, saying if I hated being there so much, I should just leave. I finally felt tears rolling down my cheeks. I told him it was because I had loved him, because I had believed in our marriage, but now I realized that had been a mistake. I headed for the door but turned back one last time, telling them I would see a lawyer tomorrow and file for divorce, and this time I meant it. I left the room and climbed the stairs to what used to be our bedroom. Once inside, I closed the door and let myself collapse as tears flowed freely. I don't know how long I stayed there, crying silently and replaying the events that had just unfolded over and over in my mind. I couldn't understand how we had ended up here, how the man I fell in love with had turned into such a cruel and selfish stranger. Hearing footsteps in the hallway, I held my breath, afraid John might come to continue our argument. But the footsteps passed by, and I heard the guest room door close. Apparently, we would be sleeping separately tonight. The next morning, I woke up with swollen eyes and a dull ache in my chest. For a moment, I wished it had all been a nightmare, but the empty room hit me with the harsh reality of our situation. I got up mechanically and got dressed, preparing myself for another day in what had become my living hell. When I went down to the kitchen, I found John and Beth eating breakfast in silence. They looked up when I entered but quickly returned their gaze to their plates. The silence was deafening. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat as far from them as possible. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. Finally, John broke the silence, asking without looking at me if I still intended to get divorced. I took a deep breath before answering yes. John hadn't changed since last night. Beth made a disgusted snort but said nothing. John nodded slowly, as if processing information. He finally said he wouldn't stop me if that's what I wanted, but warned me it wouldn't be easy. I felt anger rising inside me again. I asked him when he had ever made anything easy for me, reminding him that I had endured months of abuse and manipulation, and now he was threatening me. John suddenly stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. He insisted he wasn't threatening me, just being realistic, saying if I wanted a divorce, I would have to fight. I stood up too, facing him. I told him fine, I would fight, for my freedom and my dignity. And that I wasn't afraid of him anymore. That's when Beth stood up and stepped between us. She told us to stop acting like children, telling me if I wanted to go, no one was stopping me. I looked at her in disbelief. After months of manipulation, now she was pretending to be the voice of reason. I felt a hysterical laugh rising in my throat, and to everyone's surprise, including my own, I started laughing. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was bitter, almost manic. John and Beth stared at me as if I had lost my mind. "What are you laughing at?" John asked in confusion. Between fits of laughter, I explained how absurd this all was. How we had gotten to this point, and how he thought he could threaten and intimidate me. John frowned, clearly puzzled by my reaction, asking what I meant and if I had lost my mind. Gradually, my laughter subsided into a smile that didn't reach my eyes. I told him no, I wasn't crazy. I just realized something very important. What? He asked, his voice thick with suspicion. I looked him straight in the eye, my smile fading. I told him he'd forgotten something crucial, something that would completely change the rules of the game. I watched the color drain from his face. He started to say something but quickly closed his mouth. And that's when I saw it in his eyes, fear, a kind I'd never seen before. John began to tremble slightly, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "Crystal," he whispered, "what are you talking about?" But I wasn't listening anymore. My mind had traveled back to that day several months ago that would change our lives forever. The kitchen fell into a graveyard silence. My unexpected laughter had confused John and Beth, but now the fear in John's eyes dominated the scene. Beth looked between us in confusion, not understanding what was happening. "Crystal," John repeated, his voice trembling, "please, explain. What is this important thing I've forgotten?" I felt an odd sense of calm take over me. For the first time in months, I was in control of the situation. I sat down slowly, took a sip of my cold coffee, and responded. With a calmness that contrasted sharply with the tension in the room, I asked if he remembered the last month before we moved. I watched understanding dawn on his face. His eyes widened and his breathing quickened. Beth, still confused, interrupted, asking what the old town had to do with anything. Ignoring her, I kept my eyes fixed on John. I commented how interesting it was that he'd forgotten about it, considering how important that month had been. John collapsed heavily into his chair as if his legs could no longer support him. "Crystal, please," he begged, "don't do this." Beth grew increasingly agitated, demanding to know what was happening. I turned to her with a cold smile. I told her that her beloved son was keeping a secret. A big, dangerous secret. John tried to interrupt, but I raised my hand to silence him. I told him it was time to tell his mother the truth. After all, she had been using the money he had obtained through questionable means. Questionable money? Beth asked, her voice a mixture of confusion and fear. "John, what is this woman talking about?" I could see John struggling internally, torn between confessing and continuing to deny. Finally, with a defeated sigh, he lowered his head. "Mother," he began in a voice barely above a whisper, "I made a mistake. A terrible mistake." Beth moved closer to her son, placing a hand on his shoulder, telling him whatever it was, they could solve it together. I couldn't suppress a bitter laugh. I told Beth this wasn't something she could fix with her usual manipulation. John looked up at me, his eyes pleading. He begged me to give him a chance to explain. I shook my head, asking what was there to explain. His embezzlement of company funds? His forged documents? How he had begged me not to report him. Beth staggered backward as if my words had physically struck her. She asked John to tell her it wasn't true, that I was lying. But John couldn't deny it. Tears began rolling down his cheeks as he confessed between sobs. He apologized repeatedly, explaining he had been desperate, that he had debts and thought he could pay it back before anyone noticed. Beth collapsed into a chair, her face a mask of horror and disappointment. She couldn't believe her son was a thief, asking how he could have done such a thing. I stood up, feeling strangely detached from the scene unfolding before me. I told Beth this was the truth. Her perfect son, the man she thought could do no wrong, was a fraud and a thief. John suddenly stood up, a flash of his old arrogance returning to his eyes. He pointed out that I hadn't reported him, that there was no evidence. It was just my word against his. I smiled, feeling an odd mixture of sadness and triumph. John had always underestimated me. I asked if he really thought I hadn't been careful. I watched the color drain from his face again as he stammered, asking what I meant. Moving closer to him, I said in a low but firm voice that I had copies of everything. Bank records, transfer records, all of it, stored safely where he couldn't reach them. John began visibly trembling, saying I couldn't do this, that it would ruin his life and career. What about my life, John? I demanded, feeling anger rise inside me again. I reminded him of the months of emotional abuse I'd endured, his mother's manipulation, how he had allowed me to be treated like an outsider in my own home. Beth, who had been silent, interrupted with a trembling voice, claiming she hadn't known. I turned to her with a bitter voice, telling her to stop playing innocent. While she might not have known about the fraud, she had participated in making my life miserable for months. John approached me desperately, begging me to believe we could fix this, promising to do anything if I just wouldn't report him. I stepped back, maintaining my distance. Now you want to negotiate, John? After threatening to make the divorce difficult? After saying you could easily replace me? I watched reality hit him hard as he realized his fatal mistake in underestimating me and thinking he could threaten me. Here's what's going to happen, I said in a firm voice, I'm leaving this house today. Tomorrow, you're going to contact a lawyer and start divorce proceedings. No fighting, no resistance. When the papers arrive, you'll just sign them. John nodded desperately, like a man ready to accept anything, repeatedly saying he would do whatever I asked. I cut him off with a gesture. I'm not finished. Beth, you're leaving this house within a week. I never want to see you or hear from you again. Beth, still in shock, could only manage a weak nod. I warned them that if either of them tried anything, attempted to contact me, or caused any problems whatsoever, I would turn all the information over to the police. They both nodded silently, defeated and terrified. I headed for the kitchen door but turned back one final time. And John, one more thing. Remember this moment. Remember how your arrogance, selfishness, and lies destroyed everything. I left the kitchen, leaving behind a void of silence and devastation. As I climbed the stairs to pack my belongings, I felt a mix of emotions washing over me. Relief, sadness, but most of all, liberation. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, it was mine to decide. 6 months earlier, the setting sun had been streaming through the windows of our office in downtown. I was absorbed in work, reviewing the company's latest financial reports when something strange caught my attention. The numbers didn't add up, and there were discrepancies in several accounts. At first, I thought it might be an accounting error, but the more I investigated, the more suspicious everything seemed. That night, I decided to stay late to thoroughly examine the accounting books. John told me not to wait for him, saying he had an important meeting. At the time, focused on solving the accounting mystery, I didn't think much of it. As time passed and the office emptied, I began unraveling a web of suspicious activities. Everything led to an offshore account that wasn't in the company's official records. When I realized the gravity of what I'd discovered, my heart started racing. Someone was embezzling money from the company, and it wasn't a small amount. Near midnight, as I was about to leave, I heard someone entering the office. I stayed absolutely still, holding my breath. Footsteps approached my private office. Crystal, what are you doing here so late? It was John. His voice was tense, almost fearful. I turned around slowly to face him. John, I've been reviewing the accounts. Something doesn't add up. I watched the color drain from his face. His eyes were fixed on my computer screen, which displayed the documents revealing his fraud. Crystal, I can explain, he said quickly, moving toward me. Time seemed to stand still. Explain what, John? What is there to explain? John collapsed into the chair next to me, his face a mask of guilt and fear. I'm sorry, Crystal. I didn't want you to find out like this. I made a terrible mistake. I felt tears welling up in my eyes. John, tell me I'm not thinking what I think I am. Tell me you haven't been stealing from the company. He couldn't meet my eyes and looked down. I'm sorry, he repeated, I was desperate. We had debts, the mortgage, plans for children. I thought I could just borrow a little and pay it back before anyone noticed. I suddenly stood up, feeling like I couldn't breathe. A little? John, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars. How could you do this? John stood too, reaching for my hands, but I pulled away. Crystal, please, listen. I know what I did was wrong, but I can fix this. I promise I'll pay it all back. I stared at him in disbelief. Pay it back? How, John? This is a serious crime. You could go to prison. Panic flashed in his eyes. No, not that. Crystal, please. You can't tell anyone. It would ruin me. It would ruin our future. My head was spinning. The man standing before me, the man I married, the man I loved, was a thief and a fraud. How had I never noticed? Our future? I whispered, John, what kind of future can we have built on lies? He moved closer, his eyes pleading. He insisted we could get through this together, that he just needed time to fix everything, begging me to give him a chance. Part of me wanted to believe him. I wanted this to be a nightmare I would soon wake up from. But reality was undeniable. It was there in black and white on my computer screen. How long has this been going on? I asked, dreading the answer. John hesitated before responding, almost a year. I felt my legs go weak. A year. A whole year of lies and deception. How many times had he looked into my eyes and told me he loved me, all while betraying my trust? I have to report this, I finally said, more to myself than to him. John turned pale. He begged me not to, saying I couldn't do this to him, asking me to think about what it would mean for us, for our family. What about the company? If this comes out, everyone could lose their jobs. Did you think about that? John fell to his knees before me, taking my hands in both of his. Please, Crystal. Give me a chance to fix this. I'll do anything. I swear I'll pay back every last cent. Just don't report me. I watched the man I loved reduced to a pathetic shadow, begging before me. Part of me wanted to push him away and run straight to the police with everything. But another part, the part that still loved him, hesitated. How can I trust you? I asked, my voice trembling with emotion. I'll prove it, he quickly responded, I'll start paying back immediately. I'll sell the car, take out loans, do whatever it takes. Just give me time. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of the decision. When I opened them again, John was watching me with a mixture of fear and hope. All right, I finally said, I'll give you a chance. But with conditions. John nodded desperately, saying he would do anything I asked. I laid out my terms. First, he had to stop the embezzlement immediately. Second, he had to pay back the money as promised. And third, if I saw him breaking his promises or discovered he was still lying or stealing, I would go straight to the police. Yes, I understand. Thank you, Crystal. I promise I won't betray you. That night, leaving the office, I felt something fundamental had changed between us. The trust that was the foundation of our marriage had crumbled. John promised to reform, but an inner voice warned me things would never be the same. I couldn't have known then that this night would mark the beginning of the end of our marriage. That in the months that followed, I would watch the man I loved transform into someone I barely recognized. And ultimately, that I would be forced to use this information as a final defense against his and his mother's manipulation. As I climbed the stairs to what used to be our bedroom and began packing my belongings, 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind. Was I doing the right thing? Should I have reported John from the start? I remembered the day I discovered the fraud, how I had wrestled with my conscience. I had chosen to give John a chance, believing he could change, that we could get through this together. What a fool I had been. As I folded clothes into my suitcase, I recalled all the moments when things had felt off, the secretive phone calls, the vague excuses about unexplained expenses, the growing distance between us. It all made sense now. Looking around the room, memories overwhelmed me. We had shared so many good times and bad times here. We had planned our future here, talked about having children, growing old together. And now it all came down to one suitcase and a broken heart. I picked up our wedding photo from the nightstand. We looked so happy, so full of hope. How had it come to this? I placed the photo in my suitcase, not out of sentimentality, but as a reminder never to let something like this happen to me again. After finishing packing, I sat on the bed for a while, allowing myself to feel the full weight of the situation. I wasn't just leaving a marriage. I was leaving behind an entire life. My dreams, my plans, everything would need to be rebuilt from scratch. But along with the fear and sadness, I felt something else growing inside me, hope. For the first time in a long while, I felt in control of my own life. I would no longer be a victim of John and Beth's manipulation. No longer would I live crushed under the weight of John's secrets. I stood up and carried my suitcase down the stairs. John and Beth were in the living room, silently watching as I headed for the door. "I'm leaving," I said simply. "My lawyer will be in touch about the divorce proceedings." John stepped forward as if to say something but stopped himself. Beth remained silent, her face a mixture of anger and defeat. I opened the door and stepped out into the warm sunlight. As I loaded my bags into the car, I felt an enormous weight lifting from my shoulders. True, the future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, it was mine to decide. As I drove away from John and Beth's house and all its painful memories, I allowed myself to smile. I didn't know exactly what the future would bring, but one thing was certain: it would be better than the past I was leaving behind. The road to my new life would be long, but every mile I drove took me further from the nightmare of the past few months and closer to a new beginning. A beginning where I would be in control, where I would never again let anyone make me doubt myself or my worth. As the town faded in my rearview mirror, I felt a tear roll down my cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness, but of liberation. I was leaving behind not just a failed marriage, but a version of myself that no longer existed. The woman driving into this new city would be stronger, wiser, and above all, true to herself. The future was uncertain, yes, but for the first time in a long time, it was mine to shape. And that filled me with something I hadn't felt in months: hope. As the sun began to rise over the horizon, I finally reached the suburban town. I had driven all night, stopping only for gas and coffee. My body was exhausted, but my mind was still completely alert, processing everything that had happened in the past 24 hours. Driving through the still quiet capital streets, I searched for the address of the small apartment I'd hastily rented the day before. It was just a studio, nothing fancy, but it would be my sanctuary now. A place to start over. I parked in front of the building and sat in the car for a while, watching the early rising residents begin their day. Couples walking their dogs, elderly people heading to the bakery, young people with backpacks probably heading to university. Normal life, everyday routines. I couldn't remember the last time my life had felt this normal. Sighing, I got out of the car and started unloading my suitcase. I hadn't brought much, having left in such a hurry, leaving most of my belongings behind. I can go back for them later, I told myself, though part of me knew I probably never would. Some memories are better left behind. The apartment was on the 3rd floor, and there was no elevator. By the time I reached my door, I was out of breath and drenched in sweat. As I turned the key, I wondered what waited on the other side. The room was small but bright, with a single bed in one corner, a tiny kitchen on the opposite side, and a desk by the street-facing window. The walls were bare and painted pure white. A blank canvas, I thought. Exactly what I needed. I dropped my suitcase on the floor and sat on the bed, suddenly feeling the full weight of the past few days. The tears I'd held back during the journey began flowing freely. I cried for my lost marriage, for the life I'd left behind, for John's betrayal and Beth's manipulation. But they were also tears of relief and liberation. For the first time in months, I could breathe without feeling the crushing weight of lies and secrets. I don't know how long I sat there, letting the emotions wash over me. When I finally looked up, the sun was high in the sky. I wiped my tears and stood up, resolved to begin my new life. The first thing I did was take a long, hot shower. As if I could wash away not just the sweat from my journey, but the residue of my old life too. While showering, I began making plans. I needed a job, maybe I could use some of my old connections. I also needed a lawyer, someone who could handle the divorce and protect me if John didn't cooperate. I stepped out of the shower feeling renewed and changed into clean clothes. Looking at my reflection in the small bathroom mirror, the woman staring back seemed almost like a stranger. There was a determination in her eyes I hadn't seen in a long time. "You can do this," I told myself, "you're stronger than you think." My stomach growled, reminding me I hadn't eaten a proper meal in hours. I decided to explore the neighborhood while looking for breakfast. Walking down the street, I was struck by the vibrant atmosphere. Trendy cafes, vintage shops, colorful murals on the walls. It was completely different from the world I'd left behind. I found a small cafe on the corner and went inside. The smell of fresh coffee and toast enveloped me, and I immediately felt at ease. I sat at a window table and ordered a café au lait and toast. While waiting for my order, I took out my phone and found several missed calls and messages from John. I ignored them all and, after a moment's hesitation, blocked his number. For now at least, I needed a complete break. There was also a message from my best friend Lily. "Are you okay? Call me when you can." I smiled, grateful to have at least one person who genuinely cared about my well-being. I sent a quick reply, "I'll call later and tell you everything." As I ate breakfast, I began making a mental list of things to do. Finding a job was the top priority. I had some savings, but I knew they wouldn't last forever. Besides, I needed something to occupy my mind and give me purpose. I also needed to start the divorce proceedings. The thought brought a sharp pain to my chest, but I forced myself to face it. It was a necessary step to close this chapter of my life and begin a new one. After breakfast, I returned to the apartment and opened my laptop. I spent the next few hours updating my resume and sending it to various companies. I also researched divorce attorneys and wrote down several names. While working, my mind kept drifting back to John and Beth. I wondered what they were doing now, if they were beginning to face the consequences of their actions. Part of me wanted to call, to make sure John was cooperating with the divorce as promised. But I knew that would only pull me back into the drama I was trying to escape. In the afternoon, I decided to take a break and call Lily. I needed to talk to someone who knew me, about everything that had happened. Crystal, Lily exclaimed as soon as she answered, finally. I've been so worried. What happened? Why are you in such a place? I took a deep breath and told her everything. About John's fraud, Beth's manipulation, my decision to seek divorce and move far away. Lily listened quietly, only occasionally making sounds of surprise and outrage. Oh, Crystal, she said when I finished, I'm so sorry. I should have noticed something was wrong. You went through all this alone. I felt tears welling up in my eyes again. Thank you, Lily. You don't know how much your support means to me. I'm here for you, you know that? Lily said, tell me if you need anything. I can come visit if you need me to. I smiled, grateful to have such a loyal friend. Thanks, Lily. Maybe in a few weeks, once things have settled down a bit. Right now I just need time to process everything and start rebuilding my life. After hanging up with Lily, I felt somewhat lighter, as if sharing my story had lifted some of the burden I'd been carrying. I decided to go for a walk. I needed fresh air and wanted to explore my new neighborhood more. The streets were full of life at this hour. Groups of friends enjoying beer on terraces, couples walking hand in hand, street musicians performing on corners. I stopped in front of a small bookstore, drawn in by its colorful window display. As I browsed the shelves, a title caught my eye, Rebuilding Your Life, Starting Over After Crisis. I took it as a sign from the universe and picked it up. Near the register, I found a notebook with "Today is the first day of the rest of your life" printed on its cover. Smiling, I decided to buy that too. Back at the apartment, I sat at the small desk by the window. I opened the new notebook and began to write, letting my thoughts flow freely. I wrote about my marriage, John's betrayal, the fears and uncertainties I was feeling. But I also wrote about hope for the future, the strength I discovered within myself, and the freedom I felt despite everything. As I wrote, I could feel something changing inside me. The pain was still there, of course, and I knew it would take time to heal completely. But alongside the pain, there was something else, hope. Hope for the future and all the possibilities that lay before me. That night, as I prepared for sleep in my new bed in my new home, I thought about everything that had happened in the past 48 hours. I had left behind my entire life, confronted betrayal and lies, and made difficult decisions. But I had also discovered strength within myself I never knew I had. I gazed out the window at the city lights twinkling in the darkness. This city, so different from the one I'd left behind, represented a new beginning, a blank canvas on which I could paint the life I wanted. The future was surely uncertain. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Would I find a job quickly? How would the divorce proceedings go? Could I build a new life in this city where nobody knew me? But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of that uncertainty. I was excited by it, because each day would bring new opportunities, and every decision would be my own. Curling up under the sheets, I felt a mix of emotions. Nostalgia for what I'd left behind, anxiety about the unknown. But above all, I felt an increasing sense of peace. I had weathered the storm and was ready to sail into calmer waters. I closed my eyes and allowed myself to imagine my life a year from now. Working at a job I was passionate about, surrounded by new friends, maybe even open to the possibility of new love. I imagined myself strong, independent, and happy. With that vision in mind, I drifted off to sleep. I was ready to face whatever the new day might bring, because I knew now that I had the strength to face anything. Tomorrow when I wake up, I'll be stronger, wiser, and above all, more true to myself. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be difficult days, moments of doubt and fear. But there would also be joy, discovery, and growth. And this filled me with hope. A hope I hadn't felt in months. More than anything else. Tomorrow is a new day. The first day of the rest of my life. And I am ready to live it fully. The woman who fell asleep that night is far different from the one who had discovered her husband's fraud 6 months earlier, or the one who had fled her home just 24 hours ago. I am no longer a victim of circumstance, but a survivor ready to write her own story. In the quiet of my new apartment, with the gentle hum of the city outside my window, I felt it deep in my bones. This isn't an ending. This is my beginning.